There's this belief that government should exercise the power of hegemony over the microbial kingdom and have all these institutions set up ready to go whenever there seems to be an infectious disease around. And the problem is that sets up a kind of a moral hazard so that, you can sort of deploy that whenever you have big industrial or political motives involved. You can just make that happen all over again. And that's what worries me. The head honcho of HHS in this case, which oversees FDA, CDC, and NIH, is Robert F. Kennedy. And people say, well, he doesn't have a medical degree. Well, that's probably, number one qualification as far as I'm concerned. But he's an evidence-based guy who's been litigating on issues of liability for consumer products and as far as they affect your health for decades. And, that's part of the market economy, is the bearing liability for the damages that your products cause. And so he's very hip to the fact that pharmaceutical manufacturers, in particular as it relates to vaccines, have been indemnified against liability. And he wants to see that change. And I think there's something to that. I also have a lot of confidence in him as a manager and as a guy with evidence, real focus on evidence and awareness of the problem of industry capture of agencies, which is a serious problem with CDC, FDA, and NIH. So that's going to be his focus. When I say eliminate the corruption, I mean I'm not saying anything controversial to say that a lot of these policies were driven by the desire to deploy this new technology on behalf of a handful of producers, Moderna and Pfizer and so on, and to guarantee a mass uptake. They have a flow chart, and the NSC is listed as the lead federal agency. And then that was a week later transferred over to FEMA. So FEMA became the lead federal agency rather than CDC or FDA or anybody else like that. And so that meant that the military was heavily involved in this. And people who were there at the time said that it was hard to tell the difference between Moderna and the military. It was all just one big sort of blob.
It's December 6, 2024, and I'm honored today to have with me I say this about a lot of people, but genuinely the illustrious Jeffrey Tucker. He is an economist. He's the principal and editor and guiding light of brownstone.org, as well as writing at the Epoch Times pretty much daily, and has a real flair for, I guess, bringing both intelligence and open-eyed clarity to all different types of subjects. And I'm very much in his debt for that, amongst other things. Jeffrey, thank you for coming on. I'd like to kind of begin with, what does winning feel like? Brownstone was at the forefront of the lockdown resistance and, resistance against tyranny and so forth. Maybe you can talk about some of your motivations therein and what has been accomplished and where do we go from here?
The lockdowns were such a calamity. The response to, the COVID pandemic was so extreme and affected our lives so profoundly. We got rid of the Bill of Rights and, canceled church and demonized singing and imposed travel restrictions. And people were putting up ventilation systems, filtration systems everywhere, speaking to clerks through plexiglass, and then having to wear Chinese cloth paper masks on our face for a year, and then having to accept an experimental injection as a condition of keeping jobs. And then we had 5 cities shut down to those people who had some doubts about that. And so all these things happened to us. It destroyed 500,000 businesses, destabilized property rights, left us all feeling vulnerable. Learning losses from public schools being closed for 2 years are extreme. Tremendous amount of cultural disorientation. I don't think it's an accident that during this period we also saw the rise of trans mania, and the rise of furries and, God knows what, just every kind of crazy thing, so to the point that, we actually medicalized hacking off genitals, which hasn't really happened since the age of the castrati, in the High Middle Ages. So, all this hell was unleashed on the world, and we're just now coming to terms with it. And right now, typically, what's happening in the world is that many governments are putting together commissions. Whoa, what did we do wrong? And I should point out that all governments in the world did this at the same time. More or less, it was the last week of February, 2020, around February 27th, when the trigger was pulled for this, and all governments in the world except for like three, Tanzania, Nicaragua, and Sweden, did exactly the same things, and the same things: social distancing and the masking and just all the hopping around frenzy, uh, with wild exaggerations concerning the case fatality rate, which was reported to be 3 or 4% at that time, and without any real testing. You can't know case fatality rates unless you know case rates, unless you know the presence of the disease. So we had absolutely no clue what was going on. Well, we had some clue, but 3 or 4% was a wild exaggeration. But even Fauci was testifying in the Senate that the mortality rate of COVID is 1%. And this is the Senate, so there's a hundred senators sitting there listening to this gibberish, and they think, because they're idiots, uh, some one of us in this room is going to die, and who's it going to be? So you could just see, the world just going up in flames. So now governments around the world are sort of puzzled, like, well, that was a little strange. I wonder what that was all about. We better look into this. And they've all concluded that there wasn't that they didn't lock down fast enough, hard enough.
That's like the leech theory.
Yeah,
They use the leeches, not the patient dies, wasn't enough leeches.
yeah, didn't bleed them enough. There's that, and then the other thing that every single bureaucracy, every commission ever in the history of humanity has concluded, that there wasn't good enough communication and coordination. Yeah, so there's that. So we didn't communicate our public health advice well enough. We didn't coordinate well enough between agencies. Well, the special subcommittee on the COVID response, put together by the U.S. House of Representatives, has just come out with their 550-page report with 2,000 plus footnotes. And I have to tell you, it's a very satisfying read in a way, because they say, oh, these lockdowns were devastating. School closures were harmful. The masks didn't work. The people who did all these things were not really reading the evidence and considering the costs and the benefits. And so to that extent, I think the report is a satisfying read. I mean, it's based largely on a template as laid out by a thing called the Norfolk Group, which had met 2 years ago, and very inauspiciously sort of released it as a template for investigators. And so it's based in part on that. It goes a lot beyond it a little bit, with some criticism of media censorship, and even some decent criticism of the Federal Reserve uh, for its $6 trillion in money printing that led to 40% loss in purchasing power over 4 years. So it's okay, and I want to celebrate it. I really do. But I will say that there is a lot of oversights in the report. There's nothing about the rental moratorium that was imposed right away. There's nothing about the filtration mania, um, the plexiglass frenzy, the sanitizer baths, all of which were recommended by the CDC. And there's nothing in there, surprisingly, about the mail-in voting that was pretty well mandated and funded by the CDC. So here you have a system that everybody's known for forever to be the least secure way of conducting elections. And the CDC announces that this is the way everybody should do it, and Congress funded this with tens of billions of dollars in every state. So that's very likely contributed to a lot of the loss of confidence in the results of the 2020 and 2022 elections. So there's not anything about that in there. So there's a lot of oversights. The biggest oversight of all is that it celebrates all the lives saved by the mRNA technology, by the Operation Warp Speed. And now I you can't a priori say, well, it saved lives or not. So you need to look at the evidence. But the one evidence that they give is to a model is pushed up by the Commonwealth Fund that really the model just really does this. It says, let's say the vaccine saves lives. All right, what if people didn't get it? Well, then a lot of people would die. How many would die? Millions. So, therefore, the vaccine saved millions of lives. I just summarized the study for you, and that's the one footnote they have. And it's a little troubling. But it's interesting to me that they have given out this carve out for, well, the vaccine was good, everything else was bad. Um, I so the problem here with this kind of analytics is that the whole purpose of all the kabuki dance that we did for the 10 months prior to the release of the vaccine was precisely to prepare the population for the vaccine. In other words, we locked down to wait for the vaccine. And I've got an article coming out, I guess, I don't know, today or tomorrow, in which I give an analogy. Let's say you're in Manhattan and your car is hijacked. And the purpose of the hijacking is to get all the way to Los Angeles for a drug deal. And they put you in the back seat. And so the entire time you're complaining about the potholes, worried about the reckless driving, you don't like the music on the radio. I mean, there's a lot of complaints you have along the way. And when you finally get to your destination and you fall out of the car and the cops are there and they want you to tell the story, you tell a story about the rap music you had to listen to and the potholes you drove over and how the drivers were running over the speed limit. But you never actually address the weird fact that your car was hijacked or for purposes of a drug deal, right? So that's sort of what the subcommittee report is like.
They ignored that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a funny thing. All this part about saving lives, they're looking at at avoiding death, but they're missing the fact that life is finite. We live just a few decades, and subtracting, a substantial number of those years when people are healthy and active and potentially mating and meeting and communing and having fun and not having fun, whatever, the essential years of your life for work and growth and education, and formulation, so forth, those are just like excised. So in the tabulation, if in fact, we look at life expectancy, this year versus that year, the gross number of excess deaths, whatever, we're still ignoring the fact, again, to use your analogy, that we're locked up in a trunk for, any number of, a couple, 2, 3 years. And some people still are like voluntarily Stockholm syndrome, like going back into the trunk.
Yeah, yeah. And what worries me too is, they also appended to the 550-page book is a 18-page series of recommendations. Not one of the recommendations is to stop doing this stuff. Every one of them is to do it better next time. Better assess the costs and benefits, look at the existing literature, all this kind of stuff. But it just presumes the thing that I think is the core problem, which is this there's this belief that government should exercise the power of hegemony over the microbial kingdom, and have all these institutions set up ready to go. Whenever there seems to be an infectious disease around, and the problem is that sets up a kind of a moral hazard, so that you can sort of deploy that whenever you have a big industrial or political motives involved. You can just make that happen all over again, and that's what worries me. And it troubles me that I guess my point is I don't think we've come anywhere near, in terms of the public mind, much less the official documents, really dealing with the extent of the problems here.
Yeah, no, so much of this is, this concept. I think most people get it wrong. The term begging the question. They always think it's like to bring up a question. So that begs the question, which brings up a question. But begging the question is this, putting something in evidence that's not been established as part of your next framing. It's, petitio principi. And all of this stuff, again, as you say, kind of stipulates that all of these things were good. All of these things were well-intentioned. I think we actually kind of need to think outside this box. I've had on Sanjeev Sablock three or four times on my show, and he's an Australian, um, I guess, public health historian, PhD and whatnot, and he kind of thinks the whole public health project is has debased itself, and is ruination almost always causes the opposite effect.
Really? Yeah. I mean, I think that that's generally true. I think it's correct to say that public health began with this sort of good motivation, in the Victorian era in the 1880s and 1890s for clean water and clean, uh, that our commons are properly cared for. But the problem is that there's a presumption always in public health that um, there's a utilitarian calculus there that we can break some eggs, and you have to break some eggs to make the omelet, and so vaccine injury is not really a problem because overall we're going to obtain herd immunity through that, and we might have to ruin your life. On the other hand, you might have to let your life be ruined so that other people can be saved. There's this utilitarian calculus that's sort of at the heart of the idea of public health. That's worrisome, and I think that the power of public health powers were quite often abused by governments pretty early on. I think often of the case of Typhoid Mary, in New York and the 19 teens, where there's, typhoid was all over the place, thousands of carriers, and it was a problem. But but they targeted this one cook, this Irish immigrant, and just chased her around the state, until they caught up with her and then put her in solitary confinement for 30 years. And they on the promise they would only let her out if they could take out her gallbladder. And I don't really know what taking out one's gallbladder would be like in 1915, but I have some sense that it was not, mm, maybe not the best surgery.
Yeah,
Um,
especially since they wanted to do with hyenas and crows.
yeah, so it's a little bit, and this poor lady, sometimes she tested negative for typhoid and other times positive, so we just don't know. But the point is that typhoid went away through the same means that all the other infectious diseases kind of became less and less menacing to us, which was through three main factors: personal hygiene, and sanitation, and then of course exposure through natural immunity. That's the way we've generally dealt with infectious disease, and then vaccines made their contribution to it, and there's continuing
Yeah.
controversy.
I would put number four in there. I'm working on a book on kind of reducing the sense of guilt about cancer diagnoses. I think so much of it is just stochastic, that is random, and people kind of attribute all kinds of personal foibles and whatnot. Obviously, there's cigarettes and lung cancer. There's some direct causation ones, but for the most part, most of your cancers just happen these days because people live long enough. But the fourth one that I would add is electrification, refrigeration. The oddity that I found researching cancer in the U.S. It's similar time period in the early 20th century. The most common form of cancer in the United States and probably worldwide in the industrialized world was stomach cancer, and this
Mm.
we barely see anymore at all. And
Oh,
it's
because
just
because
interesting
the food
footnote.
doesn't spoil. The food and the meat does not is not
Exactly. So
spoiled.
when there was no Susan B. Komen, race for the cure. There were no people wearing pink little stomachs on their
Yeah.
football jerseys. None of this happened. It just there was no public activism against stomach cancer. What happened was there was electrification, and people had refrigerators in their homes. And once the food was refrigerated, there was less spoilage, less rancid food going through your
Mm.
stomach,
Mm-hmm.
less irritation, and stomach cancer just
Mm-hmm.
disappeared. It's
Mm-hmm.
not entirely gone, but it went from the most common to pretty much we don't see it at all.
Yeah,
And
that's four factors. When you have a fourth factor, you always have to have a fifth. You know that. So maybe we should add internal combustion to that, because that's what got all the horse waste off the
yeah, the
street.
horse manure. It's absolutely right.
Yeah.
People want to get rid of
Oh, and
oil.
tetanus, right? Tetanus. Yeah, in Latin, the literal Latin pronunciation is tetanus, but I guess we say tetanus, but it was spread by and caused by largely the nails in horseshoes, and they were just all over the street.
Wow. Yeah, that's really funny because we always heard medical school, step on a rusty nail, da da da.
I know.
I mean, I've stepped on a few little brads and
The
whatnot, but
stuff just survives, right? Don't step on a rusty nail. Wait, when did I just step on a rusty nail? Oh, it used to happen all the time. Well, how long ago? Well, back in the 1890s. I don't know.
so you're welcome to continue on this topic, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about, since I think both of us are a little bit skeptical of public health writ large,
Yeah,
and now we're talking about changing the leadership and guidance at some of these agencies.
yeah.
I would personally just like not to hear about them at all. But since we do seemingly have to hear about them, who should be where and what? And
Yeah.
what do you think of the choices proposed? And what will happen with some of these choices to those agencies? And should they have better roles, different roles, or no role?
Well, so the head honcho of HHS in this case, which oversees FDA, CDC, and NIH, is Robert F. Kennedy. And people say, well, he doesn't have a medical degree. Well, that's probably number one qualification as far as I'm concerned. So, but
That's because they couldn't get you.
but he's an evidence-based guy who's been litigating on issues of liability for consumer products and as far as they affect your health for decades, and that's part of the market economy, is the bearing liability for the damages that your products cause. And so he's very hip to the fact that pharmaceutical manufacturers in particular, as it relates to vaccines, have been indemnified against liability, and he wants to see that changed. And I think there's something to that. I also have a lot of confidence in him as as a manager, and as a guy with evidence, real focus on evidence and awareness of the problem of industry capture of agencies. So, which is a serious problem with CDC, FDA, and NIH. So that's going to be his focus. Jay Bhattacharya over at NIH is an interesting one. His views on pandemic policy are pretty much what used to be the mainstream views. As recently as February 2019. I mean, there was the Yale University released a document warning against coercive, compulsory measures in the event of a pandemic, and it was signed by 800 top uh, public health people. It was basically a first draft of the Great Barrington Declaration. So that was the mainstream view. There wasn't anything radical or unusual about the Great Barrington Declaration. It just was what it was. It just reiterated the same policies that the U.S. had always pursued, 2009 and in 2002 and 3, and then yeah, I think you have to skip over AIDS since that was a special case. But going back to 1968, 69, also 57, 58, both periods of very deadly flu pandemics with a wide range of age gradient, medically significant consequences. And public health was highly intelligent, very calm, a calming message. Go see your doctor if you get sick, kind of messages. If you're vulnerable and you're weak and you have comorbidities, or there's some way in which a serious flu could injure you, you maybe should stay away from Justin Bieber concert, the Beatles concerts, in this case, for a while. And that was sort of the way public health had been approached it, and that's the way the New York Times approached it. I mean, you can go back and look at all these records and say, what did the New York Times say about 68, 69, 57, 58? They said, don't panic, go see your doctor if you get sick. We're working on therapeutics, and we're going to get there. It's all going to be fine. That's what they said. So that's sort of what the Great Barrington Declaration said. And the fact that it was treated like some sort of extreme document, wow, this is wacky, is a measure of how far the Overton window had shifted between March and October when it came out. But there wasn't anything extreme about it. So Jay is just a very mainstream. He was called a fringe epidemiologist. He's a very mainstream guy, really. I mean, I'm not very mainstream in my views, but he is. And um, the fellow at CDC is a person who's very concerned about vaccine injury. And so I don't know. I think this is going to be a we need this change. I think at the top, just so that we can kind of uh, get our heads screwed on straight again about what common sense public health measures really are, and eliminate the corruption. Yeah, and when I say eliminate the corruption, I mean I'm not saying anything controversial to say that a lot of these policies were driven by the desire to deploy this new technology on behalf of a handful of producers, Moderna and Pfizer and so on, and to guarantee a mass uh, uptake of
Yeah,
these new
I feel as
shots.
if they were trying to keep the population virgin, relatively virgin, so they could trot this thing out.
Do
I
you
wrote
think that?
recently in Brownstone, Dr. Fauci's DNA of caring, which is
Yeah,
his delightfully self-professed view of himself that he just can't get around his own DNA of caring. Gosh darn it, he
yeah,
just cares too much about people. Although he stipulates that during HIV he didn't, and that was his main foible, or his
yeah.
that he wanted to fix, was that he was going to listen to people more. And of course, when COVID came around, he did exactly not that. Um, but
But now, to go back to your point about preserving the immunological naivety of the population in advance of the shot, so that's pretty dark. It was very late in all my research and reading when I came to that conclusion that might have been um, part of the goal of lockdowns and social distancing and closures and all that kind of stuff, was really to minimize exposure as a way of making sure that the population needed the shots. So I mean,
mhm.
and I don't think that I can prove that. I don't think you can,
Yeah,
unless
I
you
think it's
have
interesting as
evidence.
part one and part two. I think, in that same article, I have Fauci 1.0, Fauci 2.0. And my point is, in a sense, that they made the mRNA a Trojan horse, that they wanted to bring this in without having ever passed phase one trials on its own through a couple decades of mRNA conceptions and ideas and so forth. They'd never gone to phase two and phase three, which are the more significantly safety oriented ones for human usage. And so they just wanted to basically trundle this off onto people and billions of people by keeping people, vaccine naive, and illness naive, so they could do the population experiment on just everybody, which is really horrible, I think. And it's kind of a corporatist, instrumentalist, fascistic tendency that was exhibited here. And it's a sadness. Mind you, this is not even as bad as what they did afterwards, which is start to give the vaccine after the fact as quote unquote boosters. And they just abandoned propriety and medical dogma completely, because vaccination is always a kind of a prophylactic thing, and not after the fact, not after you've had the illness multiple times and it's mutated away. And this is almost even a worse crime, in my view, that they just kept trotting this out over and over again. I have friends and intelligent people, theoretically, who've taken 5, 6 shots of this stuff already, and it's they're older, so it doesn't necessarily affect the gene pool and whatnot, but it does affect my sensibilities about them.
Yeah, it was remarkable to have this constant release of these boosters and another booster and then a shot and then a thing and then and every time there was a mutation, they were shocked by this. Well, that's the whole point, is that and the reason why respiratory viruses with zoonotic reservoirs are resistant to vaccination is precisely because they tend to mutate more. And my understanding from a lot of the hyper specialists in this area is that vaccinating during a pandemic of a respiratory virus is going to create a sort of a, 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 a an accelerator drive for mutations. So the in a sense the virus, which is already smart, and it's smart, or else it wouldn't be spreading so widely. In other words, it doesn't kill the victim typically. So it's an intelligent virus. It just keeps moving and moving. So if it's intelligent enough to not kill under all the exposures. Like Ebola is a stupid virus, whereas
Right.
SARS-CoV-2 is a smart virus. Then it's going to be smart enough. Of course, they don't have volition, but we're speaking
Right.
in
Yeah, it's kind of like
metaphor.
drone warfare. It's death by a thousand pricks.
Yeah,
It's not so much. I mean, I don't mind that part per se, because I think that basically you have kind of a balance scale, and you either have extreme danger or you have extreme prevalence. And the common cold has a lot of prevalence, but not that much danger. Ebola has a lot of danger, but doesn't really prevail because it's more like a kind of a bomb explosion, and
yeah,
everyone stays away afterwards. So I think
yeah,
humans react to the thing. It's not just the virus hits a population, everyone just
yeah.
is fixed in place. People react to a situation.
That's
So
right.
over time it was always going to taper off. I've my canine example, like wolves and schnauzers. Schnauzers have been with us for generations, or pick your favorite dog type. And wolves come in and out, but they have a zoonotic. They have basically a host area where they can stay away from humans. But as a virus, in these coronaviruses, some of them obviously were zoonotic, living in their own population. But as they came into the human population, they will basically have to adapt just to going from person to person to person, like a mosh pit. Getting body, the Taylor Swift getting, probably not her, but somebody getting kind of body surfed over the crowd. You can't kill any of the people holding you, or else you don't get to travel as much. So over time we've basically commuted or mutated this thing through our interaction, not intelligence, but just kind of
Yeah,
genomic, genetic,
yeah, yeah.
germ politics, as you will. Into something that's much less virulent. But
Yeah.
people didn't react that way mentally, and they're still resistant. There's like the last Japanese soldiers. There's some people still holding out with masks and whatnot.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Well, I'm glad you brought up this sort of trade-off between severity and prevalence, because that is essential. But there's one condition that can alter that strict mathematical relationship there, and that is latency. So the longer that a virus is latent and asymptomatic in your body, the more you can spread it. And so the latency of a typical coronavirus would be, 2 or 3 days. That would be typical. But in the early days of this one, they claimed that it had a 2 week latency. The purpose of that was to scare people into thinking they were transmitting it without really feeling sick. And this is why Deborah Birx's book was called something like Silent Spread. Something like that. Well, that's what makes this unique, silent spread. But it turns out over time that SARS-CoV-2 didn't have any different a latency than a typical common cold. I mean, it's typical. Unlike, say, AIDS, which is said to have this long, long period of latency. And I'm fascinated by this because, like, you have to put yourself in the head of somebody who's trying to make a virus. If such people exist, I'm pretty sure they are out there. And you're dealing with this kind of limitations, severity, prevalence. You can choose one or the other. But if you really want something to be prevalent and severe at the same time, you've only got one factor to play with, and that is the latency factor. So if you're manufacturing a virus, you want to somehow figure out a way to make it lay low in the body for a very long time, and then it hits you and you just drop dead. Okay, that would sort of be the goal. But I don't know that virus makers have ever been successful at that. But I thought it was fascinating that Birx immediately went to the idea that it had an unusually long period of latency. When she was discussing this, this is very unusual. Virus has a long period of latency. Really, how do you know that? And what makes you say that? I mean, why?
Yeah.
And why did you call your book that? I mean, there's like a lot of things about that were. I'm
Could
suddenly
you
realizing
repeat the book title?
it's called something like Silent Spread. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's her whole point of that. Like, why do we have to freak out about this? Well, because it has a long latency period. That's why. That's her thesis of her book, and the thesis is wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. But that was what she said, and really, she was very well connected within the sort of virus makers, virus printers, and countermeasure printers and makers industry for a very long time. And the fact that she was advertising this long latency period, and as a characteristic of this particular virus as a way of saying that the traditional trade off between prevalence and severity does not pertain in this case because of a long period of latency. And she held on to that for 2 years, and until it just became completely untenable. Basically, if you get COVID, you're going to feel symptomatic in a couple of days, or your body's gonna fight it off and it's gonna go away. That's so it's nothing unusual. It's just basically what you would experience with um, any other respiratory virus. It's nothing unusual. There wasn't it, but for her to claim that it was really interesting.
Hmm. So her provenance leads me to my next question. If I'm not mistaken, she was a creature, or she was brought in by the kind of the security apparatus. And I was reading Debbie Lehrman's article, which you highlighted on your X feed, um, about the takeover of the pandemic response, and we call it pandemic response, by the NSA. And what did that mean? Was that a distinction without a difference? Would things have been any different if it had been led by the likes of Francis Collins or Dr. Fauci and so forth? And what type of operation was it? And I guess embedded in that question is how much of the NSA is bureaucracy and how much of it are political appointees? I mean, a lot of it's just cabinet members and whatnot. So wouldn't they have been Trump loyalists primarily, or was this thing somehow co-opted by anti-Trumpers?
Big questions. Well, the agency in question is not the NSA; it's the NSC, right? So
Oh, I'm
National.
sorry. I
No,
apologize.
that's all right. And if you look at the November, the March 13th PANCAP adapted, I think it's the name of the document that was
Yes, PANCAP A or something.
yeah, yeah. Um, that the New York Times distributed, about a month later, is marked confidential. They have a flowchart, and the NSC is listed as the lead federal agency. And then that was a week later transferred over to FEMA. So FEMA became the lead federal agency rather than CDC or FDA or anybody else like that. And so that meant that the military was heavily involved in this. And people who were there at the time said that it was hard to tell the difference between Moderna and the military. It was all just one big sort of blob operation. So in her theory and her view of things, public health was the cover story, but the actual story was it was a classified military operation from the beginning, which kind of makes sense if you believed that there was a lab leak and the lab leak came from a Chinese American tax funded lab that was working on bioweapon defense, and there was a leak that came from it in the fall of 2019, which is what we believe. 5 months later, they're already worrying about, and it's spread it all over the place, right? But they're worried about how do we prepare for mass distribution of the countermeasure, and that's when the military came into action. But the problem here, Randy, is that a lot of this information is classified. So, what you're getting from these subcommittee reports are just sort of public knowledge sort of things. But in Washington, there are two layers. One is public information, and the other is classified information. You don't necessarily want access to the classified information because as soon as you have that information, you're now subject to um, suspicion that you're spreading it, and there are very severe consequences that come with that. So you want to know as little classified information as possible. It's sort of an objective. Now,
As a journalist, you mean?
as a staffer,
Hmm.
a congressional staffer, somebody on the NSC, really in any bowels of the bureaucracy, you really don't want to be tagged as you're it. Here's your classified information, because releasing that information becomes a felony and subject to tribunals of severe sorts. So you want as little classified information as possible. So, anybody tries to tell you something classified, like just hang up the phone immediately because it's like the last thing you want.
It's the worst kind of virus.
Yeah, and the people who very early on in the pandemic were given this classified information, namely that it was a lot. Look, I'm speculating to some extent because I can promise you I have no classified information. I'm pleased to say, um, but um, but the people that were told that it was a lab leak from a bioweapons lab that was co-funded by the CCP in the U.S. and USA. And but fortunately, we have a countermeasure coming. People who are told all that information, um, have to hold on to that information, and especially they have to hold on to the people who are responsible for passing that on to them, and in fact, they have to carry that information to their death unless it's somehow released, by the president or the U.S. Senator and declassified. Then you can talk about it. But until that happens, we're not going to find out the fullness of what Debbie Lehrman's thesis is. We won't be able to find out those details until there's some sort of statutory change.
Yeah. So, but my question is, I apologize for the wrong acronym, but whether it's NSC or not, what actionably would have transpired differently, one
Oh,
way versus the other?
well, I tell you what, and I don't think I'm saying anything that any of your listeners would disagree with. Um, in the at the height of the lockdowns, I'm talking about 2020 and 2021. There was a profound sense that we didn't know what was law and what was not, much less what the penalties for violating it were, or who would be enforcing it, or where to go if we were wrongly accused of skateboarding, or being on the wrong beach,
The
or
crime of skateboarding.
yeah, or having too many people in your house party. I mean, like, and for a lot of people, that was it was the rules were being passed down so strictly. I mean, you just look, when you look at the elevator, it says only four people allowed in this elevator at a time. It's like, well, what if I want to put five in there? What am I going to get fined? By whom? What is that fine? To whom do I pay it? What if I don't pay it? Then what happens to me? I mean, we had lots of questions like this. And I just assumed that I've never lived under martial law conditions, but I assumed that it feels something like that, that there's just this powerful, coercive authority out there issuing commands that don't really have the force of law, but you have to comply with them anyway. You don't know what the consequences of not complying. I'll just give you an example. March 16th, an agency called Cyber Security Information Security Agency, CISA, issued nationwide a PDF that explained the difference between an essential and unessential employee, and faxed this out to every company, every county, every corporation, or even small businesses, got copies of this, and they had to look at it and figure out, is my business essential or is it unessential? Who among my employees is essential and who is not? Okay, but then you wondered, why do I have? Who granted me this power to decide this? And what if I decide wrongly? And also, what is this agency? and what gives them the power? This is not the Department of Labor. This is something else entirely. So it's all a little bit mysterious. In many states, you couldn't even cross the state border without a mandate of a 2-week quarantine period. Now, if you lived in Rhode Island but worked in Connecticut, and you're driving off across the border every day, you were technically in violation of the law. Or were you? I mean, that's what became crazy about it, right? If the cop stops you, you um, do do you lie and say, "Oh no, I've been hanging out here for 2 weeks," or what happens if you lie? Or do you just say, "Well, look, I work here, and I'm an essential employee," in which case go on your way. We didn't know what the rules were, and it was quite scary, for a lot of people. In those days, people would leave uh, the borders of New York and come into, for example, Massachusetts, and you would get a phone call from the sheriff. And it was a recorded message, but the sheriff would say, we see that you have left the borders of New York. Wherever you are, you must stay there 2 weeks before you return. And when you return, you must stay isolated and in quarantine for an additional 2 weeks. Okay, that's a month of your life gone. But you were actually just, whatever, you're going back the next day. Well, the sheriff's calling you saying these things. Uh, it's, are, are the police after you? How did they know that? How do they have your number? Who's enforcing this? At who's urging? Who's in charge? It was extremely spooky. So this aspect of sort of overall crazy, cray cray, authoritarian watchmadoodle with no accountability or courts, and the legislatures weren't even meeting, and so on. I think that that whole feeling was what was born of the national security angle of this pandemic response. That if it had just been left to the CDC, or yeah, just to the CDC, I don't think it would have felt that way.
Hmm. So let me ask you to put your John Le Carre hat on. Kind of Spy versus Spy, which is a great cartoon, by the way. This Cuban guy, Trujillas, I read in Mad Magazine growing up. Anyway, great stuff still. How much of our actions were reactions and overactions or overreaction, whatever you want to call it, to the fact that we were complicit in creation of this virus? My friend Andrew Huff, microbiology PhD, worked at Eco Health Alliance back in the day, before this all came out, and he and Peter Daszak um, had some kind of falling out. But he feels as if we were kind of doing a spy versus spy kind of thing, vis-a-vis China, so we could watch what they're doing by being there, and they wanted to watch us because we had better, viral microbiologic gain of function techniques, and so there's kind of this mutual devolvement down the spiral of conniving, potential augmentation of a lethal virus. And then when lo and behold, it escaped from the thing. I mean, Dr. Fauci, at some level, if he has not no amnesia, must remember having signed off on some of this stuff. And then it became kind of a CYA operation, to like CIA and CYA, I guess, both together, to kind of change the focus from their own guilt and making it into something they were going to fix. And Dr. Fauci, at some point had said, "Oh, if we does this was before COVID, if we do gain of function research, and yes, there's a problem, a pandemic, he would feel okay with that." I don't know if you've ever seen that tape, but I'm wondering, just so, do you think how to what extent do you think that this Wuhan connectivity, made people react in odd ways so that they wouldn't become the criminals?
Yeah, yeah. I think it went down something like this. I'm almost certain that Fauci and company knew about the lab leak all the way from at least October 2019 for the military games in Wuhan. They knew about it, and but it takes us all the way to the end of January before Jeremy Farrar and Fauci are on the phones, buying burner phones and holding secret meetings and trying to figure out what's going on what. But the very first impulse was to deny that it was a lab leak. Okay, um, and they knew that that was wrong, but they called out this paper called "Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2," and later paid off all the people who signed. Yeah, and paid off everybody with grants from NIH, whatever. And the authors themselves, we have emails now where they were skeptical about making these claims that they thought were very likely false. Um, so that seemed to be the very first impulse. But they decided to deny it first. Now, how does that fit in with let's say, an ambition to vaccinate the world's populations with these new products, and and that comes about because Fauci is very proud to have worked on mRNA technology for the 25 years prior, uh, which becomes a sort of subscription technology where you just kind of laser print your potion, depending on the genetic sequencing of the virus, and it allows you to respond very, very quickly to any new pathogen, real or artificial. So they wanted to get the shot out. And you have to think about alternative situations. If people believed it was a lab leak and that this was a Frankenstein monster virus, they probably would have been more willing to get the shot. But the problem was that the lab was definitely funded by U.S. taxpayers, and they did not. And I presume they thought it was more deadly than it really was. And don't forget that the initial iteration was very severe, right? I mean, but the people who caught it back in October, God, their tales of woe, really something. What's called the wild type was actually quite severe, much more severe than say Omicron became later. But so they didn't want to be blamed for having started a global pandemic and then World War III with China, right? So there's very dicey relationship at that point between the U.S. and Xi Jinping. So they wanted to kind of get that off the table. Now they had another problem though. They still had to kind of they wanted to use this virus to, and these might have been separate things. I'm not entirely sure, but as a way of kind of deploying under emergency use authorization mRNA technology, which previously had never gotten through any of the trials. It had never been authorized before by the FDA, but it could be under emergency use authorization in the midst of a kind of a panic. So as part of that, they had to rely on a kind of a new theory that had been batting around for a while. What's Fauci's co-author named David
Morans.
David Morans
Yeah.
had taken the lead on this idea, and he had been promoting this. And in fact, in an August paper in Cell, that came out in 2020, which is kind of their ex post rationale for this whole thing. They have this theory that crossover viruses are becoming an existential threat to humanity. So my puppy gets a disease and coughs on me or whatever, it licks me in the morning, licks my face, and suddenly I've got some terrible disease he picked up from eating a squirrel the previous day, and then I spread it out. So it leaps from animals to humans. So here's what's interesting about that theory. Well, if that's true, and it probably is true to some extent, why would it be a unique problem of our time as versus say 500,000 years ago or a
Hmm.
million years ago, right?
When we were, frankly, a lot closer to animals.
Right. And their idea is that this problem, this unique problem of our times, a growing problem that we can only use extreme fast printing
Right.
mRNA technology to do, is a consequence of urbanization, industrialization,
Which have to
and
be gotten rid of.
yeah, and living too closely together, moving too
Yeah.
fast. Uh, uh, I don't
Yeah.
know,
Kind of
listening to
the
rap.
WEF formulations, the Klaus Schwabian view.
Yeah, yeah. We've gotten out of hand. We just drive
Yeah.
around all the time and eat shit and just live on top of each other and use air conditioning all the time. Just like everything in the whole modern world is leading to this one terrible thing of growing spillover viruses. So that was their thinking. We will. And by the way, I'm not just making all this stuff. Like I have a strong basis for everything I'm saying. You know that, right? But so there were several parts. One is deny the lab leak to avoid culpability. The second one is to advance this spillover thing and link up with the World Economic Forum, and that fits in with climate change, ideology too, and advertise this is spillover problem as unique to the modern age that can only be addressed by mRNA, fast moving mRNA technology, vaccine passports, and widespread testing and health records. So I believe this whole scheme was well mapped out in late January. Now there are certain problems with my scenario. One is that I'm going to say on something like February 24th, 2020, uh, Fauci did an interview with the Washington Post, and they asked him if we needed a vaccine to get out of this, to get away from COVID. And his answer was no. We can control the spread of this virus through social distancing alone. I believe that he was saying that to buy them time. Uh, there was plenty of time to announce first the lockdowns as a way to control the virus, and then say, several weeks later, which indeed they did, a vaccine is on the way. So I think that was all propaganda designed to achieve the goal. And I should say that in April of 2020, I was sitting there, I was raging against lockdowns. This is stupidest crap in the world, blah blah blah. And I got a call from a guy named Rajiv Venkaya, who was working for a vaccine company, but he had been George W. Bush's lead on bioterrorism in the White House back in 2004 and 2005, and had long taken credit for having invented pandemic planning and response, and in many ways the godfather of lockdowns. And he called me up on the phone and he said, "You really need to stop all this raging against lockdowns. It's very bad." And I said, "Well, okay, but I just don't understand what's going on here. I understand who you are. I understand what you believe, but I've had a question for you. Um, Ever since I've been following your work, which is, what do you think? Like, let's say we all just live in refrigerator boxes for a month, um, and somehow this magically drives the R naught down below one, so that the virus, um, is not a problem so long as we're in our refrigerator box. Where where does the virus go? Where does the pathogen go? I mean, it's not like it jumps on a spaceship and goes to space, or falls into a squirrel hole and never. This 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 member of the microbial kingdom um, newly exists and will always exist, as far as I know. So why do you think that the human population would not continue to be vulnerable to it once we stop being locked down? And there's this long pause on the phone. He says, "I can tell you, and I'll just between us, we're going to have a vaccine." And that's the first I had heard of it. And I said, "You are not serious, are you?" He said, "I'm very serious." I said, "You can First of all, you can't vaccinate against a widespread respiratory virus."
Yeah, no, it's the wrong modality. I mean,
Yeah.
injection.
So there was that, and then I said, and plus a vaccine that's known to be safe and effective will take 15 years. And he said, "You are going to be very shocked at how quickly we get this thing out." And I said, "Well, Rajiv, good talking to you," but I hung up the phone because I thought he was a crazy person. I thought this has been,
Hmm.
had been put on a shelf somewhere, and didn't know what he was talking about because I thought it was the most insane scheme I'd ever heard in my life. It turned out he was exactly right. We were going to stay locked down until the vaccine came out.
Yeah, no, I think they had a lot of these things in mind. right from the get go. This wasn't necessarily their first rodeo, and as kind of the world's expert debunker on Zika, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but a lot of these things were there as signal. In a sense, Zika was magnified, even though it didn't really cause microcephaly ever. And didn't do in any subsequent year. It kind of kept in the popular imagination, fueled by CDC money, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and the New York Times and all this kind of stuff in books and whatnot.
Oh, they're
Popular
still they're
imagination,
still they're still making this claim. I mean, just to be clear, it's not you're not claiming that Zika doesn't exist. You're claiming that it was the cause of some,
microcephaly.
yeah, some
Yeah,
other
no, I think Zika is real. Microcephaly is real,
microcephaly.
but
Yeah,
one's a dengue virus, and dengue's never caused any microcephaly. And microcephaly is a matter of gradation, where what you decide, like who's short, who's tall, what is a small head. You have to define it and place it in the right context. And Brazil didn't have a firm standard at the time. I don't want to get too far down this, except to point out that in the later years, they said this was evidence of climate issues because we're getting Zika. It's a climate thing. It's going to creep up, and they were scaring people with they said there was a separate Zika that could go in this area and this and that, and there were two different versions, and anyway they kind of harped on this thing that was part of the climate agenda. So all these things kind of move lockstep, and they all have to do with essentially government control over you. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's always the answer is always more of their stuff prying into your stuff, and more of their stuff limiting your abilities. And it all comes down to the same thing. They all, even if their stipulations are not correct, so they are begging the question. They still have all these things in place to kind of clamp you down, and
yeah,
that's the
yeah,
objection.
and they're sticking to that line concerning Zika. I mean, every once in a while, the New York Times will deploy yet another piece. I'm sure you follow it. Where
Yeah, no,
they
I do see them. It's just I know, no, I've tried to, I've reached out to, literally 1,000 different Zika related researchers because internet and scraping and spreadsheets and mail merge and whatnot. And I've gotten like a literally fewer than a handful of responses, and those people just kind of poo poo it, even though they maintain. I mean, they're getting paid to think what they think, or they believe it anyway, and they're getting paid. But they're working on a Zika vaccine in Baltimore. Even though there's no Zika there, but they've been injecting and infecting young women in Baltimore with the Zika vaccine, with the Zika virus, which is doubly pointless because either Zika is a big bad problem, in which case you shouldn't be doing it, or it's not a big bad problem, in which case you shouldn't be doing it. But the money's there, and so I've engaged a little bit with some people, but nobody's asked me to lecture on this topic, and I wanted to debate Donald McNeil, who wrote the first book, but again, leaving all that kind of stuff aside, a lot of the stuff was there because in 2017, Bill Gates, you might have heard of that guy. He's both micro and soft in certain respects, and he devoted what he promised $100 million to Moderna if they would come up with an mRNA version of the Zika vaccine in 2017. The virus didn't cooperate by being real enough to warrant it, but the money was there, and the essence was always there to get this mRNA. This has been on, they've been champing at the bit for quite a long time to get this mRNA thing in the populace because they think it's going to cure a lot of stuff, and they're all going to get famous. So I think kind of put your A and B together with Dr. Fauci's mind, if I may, is that once I think he saw himself complicit in the causation. I don't know if you ever watched The Simpsons, but Homer Simpson famously said, "Beer, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." So I think he saw himself in that beer analogy as having caused this problem, and he was going to solve it. So he's going to be both beers, the good beer, the bad beer, and people would remember him as the guy who saved humanity by bringing the mRNA platform into
Well,
being.
there's we should not neglect our survey of past foibles without mentioning SARS-CoV-1, which figures in here very heavily. This was a virus that appeared. Probably knows libelly, but it appeared in I think Singapore and the Far East, and then, but it was quite severe. And as we discussed earlier, the prevalence and severity are inversely related, and the spread of this thing stopped pretty quickly. And I think there were some cases in Canada, but every time it would pop up, it controlled itself. Now we could argue about the role of the World Health Organization. Some people think that the World Health Organization had something to do with containing it. I tend to not believe that, but I'm just not an expert on it. But in any case, the point is that the money spigots flowed. The EU went nuts preparing for SARS-CoV-1. I mean, it's billions and billions and billions of dollars of PPE and frenzy and hysteria. And I mean, I don't think that that really became a big deal in the United States, but certainly in Europe, it was became one of the biggest scam rackets of the decade. But the money got people's attention, you know, and the World Health Organization advertised itself as having been the savior of humanity for having contained that virus.
Yes, yeah, I think that's in the heroic arc that everyone wants to put themselves. They all want to be the savior and never the cause. So, when things go bad, they're going to save you with this magic wand that they've created and saved, in reserve for us. It's kind of an odd. I mean, I suppose it's human, or a group human, but they want to be the heroes.
Yeah. So you get the money, something that easily generates seemingly billions of trillions of dollars of money out of nowhere, and creates heroes and then tempts bureaucracies into the idea that they're going to control the human population by controlling something that people cannot see, whether it's the climate or the microbial kingdom or whatever. And it's all just too tempting, for bad actors, and that all came together, in 2020 at a very interesting time politically, where you saw the EU falling apart with the rise of Brexit. You saw um, uh, uh, Brazil turning towards Trumpy style populism, and then the rise of Donald Trump. In the United States, which he was never approved to be president, and that became a problem for the powers that be. And so it was one hit on him after another from the time he got elected, and then finally, this lab leak happens. Accidentally or deliberately, we really don't know. But in 2019, and it just became the perfect opportunity. And listen, it's not. Um, I don't believe that it's a coincidence that all these things came together at once. I mean, on March 16th, I believe it was, the CDC announced, that that everybody should do mail-in ballots, for the November
Really, that
election.
early?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Congress passed legislation funding uh, mail-in ballot infrastructure in every state. So
Wow.
basically, paying everybody for mail-in ballots. I mean, that you know, either they're just magically prescient, about like
Mhm.
how to foment distrust in elections, or it was all just deliberate. And I
Well,
tell you this.
I think it was deliberate, and I think they wanted to create a situation where Donald Trump could be chopped down to size. He was running the best economy since in a quick presidential turnaround since Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan took a couple of years to do it. And Trump didn't have the 17% inflation initially and whatnot. He did a good job, and I think he was going to win in the polls, and I think that terrified them, and they didn't. They want their world to be their world. I think we've seen this very clearly, that whether whatever the deep state is, the kind of our modern royalty, they want their quote unquote jobs, even though they're probably just little fiefdoms and whatnot without much. They're probably like the guys in Qatar who run around. The part of extensions of the royal family. They've got titles but don't have to work that hard.
Yeah, you've got another thing, an Operation Randy, that I've been playing around with in my own mind, but it has something to do with the interrelationship between the rise of the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, IMF, International Criminal Court, and so on. All these international institutions that are being built up and become very decisive over national policy are not subject to any kind of plebiscite at all.
Mm-hmm.
They're just bureaucracy appointed and live off contributions from member states. A major aspect of that involves the sloganeering concerning free trade. So you take away from states their sovereign, traditionally sovereign rights to determine um, tariff policies, and you've removed from them a major element of plebiscite control over government. So, in other words, the elected leaders are no longer in a position to weigh in on behalf of this constituency or that constituency, or for that manage themselves as a sovereign nation, or much less control their borders and all that sort of thing. Well, when Trump came in 2016, he took on a 70-year trajectory of ever less discretionary power for nation states over their own trade policies, and 70 years of what they call free trade. I don't think it really is free trade. I mean, that's a different argument. That's what they called it, free trade. And he's like, screw this free trade stuff. I'm going to be president of the United States, and it was too much because that it began to that assertion of his power as president to manage a single nation according to the wishes of those people who elected him just flies in the face of these globalist ambitions
Yeah,
to
I mean, it,
detach
it
government
probably
institutions.
wouldn't matter if he were the president of Belize and said that, but because he's the president of the United States, it matters because that is they fund the UN, they fund the WHO, they fund NATO, they fund frankly all of pharma. We pay so much more for our healthcare, and this is kind of in the news, unfortunately, because of the crazy assassination of the CEO. People are all going kind of people. I don't know. I kind of question sanity here and there, but we pay a lot for healthcare because everyone else has a socialized system. We are the driver of pharmaceutical innovation, and there is such a thing. I'm not anti-pharma per se. I take a pill for prevent gouty arthritis. It works great, and I'm happy it's there, and I'm happy somebody keeps making it. Happy somebody invented it, and maybe go to the next thing. I'm not against innovation per se, but you know we are really the stir, the straw that stirs the drink, or whatever, however you want to call it. We're both the tail and the dog wagging, and so if we turn against that, all their little niches, all their fiefdoms, all their comfortable jobs that as we finding out from Elon, are probably in large part no-show jobs, which again I think you and I can agree is better than having them do malfeasance daily, but still they're getting paid for doing very little. And this is not the way things should operate. They're not our kings. They're not our countesses and monarchs and earls and whatnot. They should stop it, and they should learn to code or whatever, learn to plant solar fields or something like that.
Yeah. Far be it from me because you're an MD, but I've heard that gouty arthritis is best treated with sauna rooms and sweating. So,
Well, we can take that offline. The problem is it just comes out it comes out episodically. So the allopurinol works to prevent it, and I can analogize on that topic because I find it fascinating. Samuel Johnson had it, and back in the day, the English used to get tophaceous nodes on their earlobes and their noses. So you see a lot of those Roland drawings and that era, kind of all this bulbous stuff on older men's faces. And that's
yeah.
because they didn't have central heating, getting back to our technology question. And so their rooms were freezing at night, but they were covered in blankets. So it's kind of the peninsular parts of your body is where it's a little bit like snow. You have one of these days where there's moisture, but it's getting cold, and then all of a sudden it precipitates. And gouty crystals, the uric acid crystals, they'll precipitate in the cold spot. So they go in your tip of your nose, the tip of your ears, and your toes and your fingers and whatnot. But those are under the blankets for those Englishmen. So it's kind of a fascinating topic. And allopurinol does work on kind of acting as the guy in the chop shop that breaks uric acid down to urea, so it doesn't cause the snow. Now, once you have an attack, that's a separate thing. Maybe that those things work, and I'm not opposed to that. So the treatment is, but I actually don't even get to the point where I have the attacks anymore. So that's awesome.
Okay.
But so we went a little bit over time, and I'm so honored to spend the time with you.
It's fun to talk about. Well, you're one of the few people on the planet I can go into such depth because
well, I appreciate it, and vice versa. I have to say, for an economically oriented guy, you're a wealth of knowledge. I mean, Adam Smith had the wealth of nations. You have the wealth of a few different nations, populating your mind. You come up with the facts, breezily and easily, and I'm very impressed by that. I mean, you've kind of captured the kind of the dynamic and some of the intrigue and that may lie behind it. And I'm in your debt still. For that timeline, the bioweapon hypothesis timeline of Trump's conversion from skeptic to
Yep.
buying into
Yeah.
the
And we didn't get into that, but I mean, that happens, about March 10th or something. It's so this is one of the great mysteries. I mean, in the Agatha Christie sense of like a long story that you can just tell and tell and tell, and we haven't come to the last chapter yet. So it's increasingly intriguing, and we have some outlines of a story, and I think a lot of the outlines of that story are correct. But I think, still have a long way to go to get the fullness of the story, and that's part of what we do at Brownstone. And I appreciate your contribution to those efforts too.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really, I'm happy you raised the flagpole so that some of us can salute. And it's been you know, I I don't know if I overthink things, but I think a fair amount about stuff, and it's been a great outlet for me to get some of my thoughts conceived and crystallize a little bit like gouty arthritis, uric acid crystals, and hopefully they cause a little bit less pain, or maybe just the right pain for the right people in the right places, those who deserve it. Just to kind of round things out about democracy, H.L. Mencken. To this point, in a sense, he said democracy is the concept by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it, good and hard.
Yeah, that's
And so that's kind of like what Boris Johnson's people got. And maybe, we sort of got that through the subversion of Trump's first term. Hopefully, we do it vice versa a little bit, and in a very nice way, because we're nicer people.
Yeah, I hope so. Exciting times ahead, regardless. Thank you so much, Randy.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Appreciate your time.
All the best.